to the restarting construction projects after the coronavirus lockdown, and how can we deal with issues that arise using techniques within Powerproject. So that is my focus. My name is Richard Ormerod. I've got a background in the construction industry in the UK, and this is primarily focused on that, but I see we have many international people with us today, and the software is popular in many other regions, and all of the techniques are applicable everywhere. I work for Elicosoft. We produce the Powerproject software. Been doing that for a long time, so we feel we've got a good handle on it. We're offering something that is both easy to use and very powerful. So it's easier to use than Microsoft Project, at least if not more powerful than P6. And I'll be showing some of those both of those factors today, I think. It's available not just in the UK in English, it's available all over the world, including a couple of variants of English like Australian and American. And whilst we are talking about a piece of software today, whoever provides your Powerproject is also very focused on providing a service around that. So we run a well-staffed, knowledgeable help desk that are easy to talk to and reach, and you talk to a human being who knows what they're on about. We can offer training and support, all of which is remote presently. Powerproject is used by the vast majority of construction projects in the UK, and we have many thousands of users worldwide. So that's really just some background advice. So turning to the problem that faces us all, where we've had a schedule, a program that's partly completed, the sky's fallen in with COVID, then I'm going to try and show you how you can use the Powerproject to model the impact of productivity, primarily today productivity changes to the existing activities, but also how to handle external events. And whatever you do, you need to be able to prove it as best you can, and that means collecting lots and lots of records, emails, documents, photographs, etc., and keeping that well organized, because you're going to have to back up what you show in the schedule. And also, a word of caution, this is a rapidly moving situation, so what you do today will probably need to be amended in a week or two, depending on what happens. And all your assumptions are reasonable today, but they may need updating in the future. So what we're doing now is going to be a sort of rolling wave of scheduling, and when we start the program, when we start what we're doing, you've got to have a robust program in place to start with. So it's got to be able to fully reschedule, respond to changes, and we can check that in Powerproject before you start. And we need to ideally have made any resource or cost assignments that we're going to do before we baseline it. So even if you have to baseline it at the current state, it would be better than not doing that. Of course, it goes without saying that you should always have a baseline, a snapshot of a moment in time, important moments in time, like starting the project, last significant agreed change, or when the potential impact happens. So you've got a snapshot of what happened. And just as important as that, you should have an as-built program. So it shows you what you actually did do and what you still intend to do, and not that you've got completed activities in the future and uncompleted activities in the past. And I'll just very briefly touch on that. And then I'm going to talk about how we can highlight sections of the program to indicate when things happened and their knock-on impact at the end. And primarily, I'm going to be focusing on using resources to model the impact for tasks and across the whole plan, because what we're trying to do is cope with social distancing, less people coming onto a site, less people in a work area, but we've still got to do the same amount of work. So we're trying to get the peak of workers down. And obviously, if we don't have resources, I'll be covering 3 scenarios. where you just change duration and keep notes about it, where you have another value that you can quantify things on, which we call task work, and also we can use some sophisticated calendaring techniques to have a very rapid impact to show different rates of production. So, and then also going to model at the end those external impacts and just have a quick look at what you can do with some costs, particularly on things like prelims. So from this point on, it's just a product demonstration. So I'm just going to pause at this moment. So here we are in Powerproject. I've got my project open. We have recorded what we've actually done. So we've got some actuals, which are obviously the black marking. It hasn't gone exactly to plan, and we can compare that to our baseline. So that is the original status. So we've tracked what exactly has happened up to the event happening, which was that we had a lockdown. And what we need to show now is that this program is robust. So in version 15 of Powerproject, and this is the latest version 15.02, which is downloadable from our website, there's a quality check section, which I would urge you to consider in this exercise, because there are a couple of ways of doing this. There are a couple of published tests, if you like, or series of tests. And so going behind the scenes, looking at the US one, then there are lots of possible checks, and you tick something and set a value. So if we've missed more than 5% of tasks, we will get a warning, and so they accumulate together and we get an overall result. So we can see that we get about a 96% validation, and our logic should be correct. So when we reschedule and we change something, it will definitely have an impact, and this can prove it. And you need to be in that state, really be confident before you start. And as I say, I also think you definitely need to have a baseline, which you've seen, and also we need to have progress against actually what happened, and not just marking up progress, because we can see that in various ways. We could just project the baseline, and we can project the progress onto it. So this is the baseline plan, and every progress period, I'm just putting the percentage that we actually did onto the baseline. So this is the contracts manager's view, where it can pretend that the end date isn't going to change, whereas we know we can keep an actual record and always produce that. So and if you do have to start with that position because you haven't got a robust schedule, then we can help you a little bit, because you can download a macro from our website for free called Progress Transfer, and you can move completed activities into the period in which they happened, but you would still need to make sure the schedule is robust. So so now we're going to turn to talking and thinking about resources. So I have got some resources on this plan. And what I should also say, just before I start that, is if we go to the end of this time, so we had this 3-day lockdown, 2-day lockdown, which produced this, and I've highlighted that with a green stripe, and so that has an impact on the end of being 2 days later than we originally said we would be. So our projection before we make any productivity impacts is the 8th of October. Okay, so we're going to talk about resources. So I have got this plan resourced. I have got a view already established, and views are quite important and easy once you set them up. And so in this instance, I've got a Gantt chart, and I've got a series of columns showing resource values for different resources, and I've got 2 histograms at the bottom. The lower histogram is looking at information from the baseline, and the top histogram is looking, and of course they are the same at this moment, they're looking at resources from the live activities. So you can select which resources you want to view by ticking whichever resource is there, and you can choose a preset graph, or you can make your own, and they're based on formula, and there's a lot of functionality in that area, and it's just too much to try to delve into that today. And so we need to go back to basics a little bit and say that we need to have resources in our library. So on the left-hand side, you can see those, but a better environment to edit those in is in the Library Explorer, because you get a full sort of Windows Explorer drag and drop editing environment. So you can take a resource and you can right mouse click, drag to copy. You can select a whole series of them and take the properties, and you can edit that, everything all in one go for things that are common. And so we need to create resources, and we'll look at setting up default values shortly. So then I've got spreadsheet columns. So again, just to quickly run through that, I've got a column that is the number of people. So that is from the resource field group called resource allocations. And for that, you can qualify that it's to be a labor type resource rather than a material type resource, and you can choose which individual resource this column is addressing, and so that allows you to edit those numbers in the cell. And the same thing with the effort. So that is again in the resource group, as you would expect, of field values and effort, and again you can qualify it in the same way. So this column is looking at the number of man hours, but I've said I want it in days. So if I were to create a say a 10-day activity here, and I were to say, well, I could either drag and drop from my list. So I've got a default of 2 carpenters set up in this. So as I drag across, it allocates carpenters to that activity, and the graph down below increased. So if I just undo that and redo that quickly, you can see the graph go up and down. But the mode of resource operation is by default is if I change the number of resources, say to 4, it has no effect on the duration of the activity. And equally, if I change the activity, then it's got no effect on the quantity. So how we can adapt that is because behind the scenes, and this is the default when we assign it, we can say what happens with what we call resource modeling. So I'm going to look at that on an individual resource, but what we would want to do when we decide what we want is set everything in the library to be the default we want. But we can see those resources as tasks on the bar chart if we reveal those resource allocations on screen. So underneath every task now is not a baseline, but is it's called a resource bar, and that allows me to either right mouse click properties, double click, and we get the same dialog. So for this individual allocation, I can say, well, I don't want it to be non-model, and that is I can just increase the number of resources and it doesn't change the duration. I want to have what is, and there are many techniques here, so you can have a quantity of work for the allocation itself, quantity of work for the task that the allocation is drawn, or a total man-hour budget on the activity that all resources draw on. We're looking at doing effort on allocation. Essentially what that's doing is setting up a little equation, and I want to calculate the duration from this point forward. So the duration is the number of man days, hours, divided by the number of men. And we also got this over here called the balancing parameter, and that's which one of these two should change if the main parameter changes. So if the duration were to change, if I were to change it to 12 days, do I want the number of man hours to stay the same, or do I want the number of people to stay the same? So I want to change the number of people. Okay, so having changed that, if I were to say, well, now I've only got 2 people doing this, then what hasn't changed is the number of man hours, man days, and what has changed is the duration of the activity. So if I were to say, well, I want to change the duration, say we can do it in 15 days, then we'll need 2.67 carpenters. And in fact, what would happen is that we would probably do it in 14 days, 6 hours, 14 minutes or something. So, but mainly people are thinking about days. So that is the technique to use, because we want to get everything in that state. So then I can say, well, if we only use one of these guys, everything's going to change. So how do we do that if we've already allocated the resources? Well, the easiest way to do that is to, and I don't need this activity here anymore, but the easiest way to do that is perhaps a functionality that most people don't delve into, and that is you can see the bar chart for resources. So if you right mouse click on any part of the resource tree or an individual resource, you can get what is called a RBS, a resource breakdown structure. So then we're only looking at all of the resources of that type, all the resource allocations from the activities that they've been assigned to wherever they are in the project. So I've got this bunch in the superstructure, this bunch in the substructure, and you can edit the values in these tables, and you can drag and drop the activity, the resource allocations, and that can affect the task. So this is a very, very useful view. What it does allow us to do is to get to the properties behind everything. So I can select one thing, and I could use the shortcut to select everything, or do Control A on the keyboard, and then I could use properties to affect that, but that has selected those items that are already completed, and I don't want to change my completed activities. So a better behavior is to click on the first one and shift click on the last one, and it does not select the completed activities, it only selects the uncompleted activities. And with those activities selected, we can take properties on any of them, and that means in fact all of the selected ones. So then I can set that default behavior on all the resource allocations, and I need to do that for any other resources I've got assigned. And you can see all of the resources for everything in just one level. So really a really cool bit of functionality that most people perhaps don't delve into, but in this case is extremely useful. Anyway, and then we go back to the work breakdown structure. So we just click on part of the hierarchical tree view, and we can turn off our resource allocations at that point. And so then what I did is I went through the whole program in conjunction with the supply chain, the trade contractors, and we reviewed the number of people depending on the circumstance. And that's just too long to work through in a webinar. So you're going to have to sort of believe me in that I did that in a diligent manner. And I've said in doing that we're only going to have a sort of 50% productivity till the end of May, and then we're going to have a 75 productivity from the start of June to the end of August, and then hopefully we're going back to normal after that. And that modeling of the resources produced this result. So I changed every resource allocation which had an impact on the duration of the activities, and then I rescheduled, and it ended up with a end date of the 2nd of December, which I've highlighted in this sort of light yellow color, and that's given us an additional 7 weeks and 4 days, nearly 8-week extension to the end date due to those social distancing measures. Now, the only flaw with this method is if you've got an activity that spans a period of productivity change. So here I've got a bit in August, a bit in September. So the bit in September should be at 100%. The bit in August should be at 75%. I didn't do that, but we could then split this activity at a particular date and change the values on either side. So, but we've ended up with something that is quite a dramatic change. But the important thing that we can demonstrate from this is by looking at the resource graphs again, where the graph at the bottom is what we originally were going to do. So that was that original one. We had a peak of 18, 16 people in towards the end of May in this, the harshest sort of social distancing impact, and that's been reduced. So we flattened the curve. How often have we heard that term recently? And so in our live project, the top one of these two graphs, we're now projecting a peak of only 12, and that's going to come much later at the end of June, beginning of July. And so we've accommodated the same amount of work with really the same amount of people, but spread over a longer time. And this allows us to prove that, and no other technique that I'm going to talk about will. So I still think this is the most robust method. It might not be the quickest method, and we can all quibble about the accuracy of people's estimates, but that is where we're at. So that is the main thrust of today's webinar. Is that I wanted to do a very quick run from basic resourcing to how you can quickly have that impact. But if we go back to my previous starting point, I then want to talk about other ways of adjusting durations, because many people are going to be in the situation where they have not got resources on their plan, or at least on certain aspects of their plan, and they still need to make allowances. So if we look at, say, this activity here on screen, which was 5 days, and I'm going to sit down with the trade contractor and we're going to talk about it and see what they can accommodate. And so I want to remember that we've done that, and I want to leave behind a trail of information. So I've also made a code library which is going to say, well, I've discussed it with these guys and the duration has been impacted, and so that allows me later on to filter out and group those things that I have yet to discuss with trade contractors, etc. And so collectively, we've come to the conclusion that that's going to go up from 5 days to 7 days. So we can say, well, that's going to be 7 days, and we can reschedule to see its impact. But I want to store that there's information behind it. Why did we do that? So if I go to the properties of that activity and look at the notes section, I can leave, as you always have been, generic notes in the top, but they're just additional. You just add to them, and so it becomes a long narrative, and it can consume a lot of screen space if you want to display it. So we introduced in version 15 this slightly better way in the bottom, where I can have a series of individual notes, and they're all dated. So to save time, I'm copying and pasting a bit of text, and I'm saying that this is the discussion that I had. I could leave people's names, dates, etc. And when I say okay, you see it's got a date on it. I could have another note the next month when things happen. So I'm building up a history, and it's sort of nicely segmented. I can still go behind that and edit it, so I can still change it, and the date will update. So we can then see the that information in a column. So we can see timed notes in a column, and we can also give that column a date range, so it only shows us the notes that fall in that particular date range. And if I display notes on the body of the plan, then I get that little yellow diamond, which if I hover the mouse on it, then it will reveal the note. So that's useful if you're not displaying that as a column. So I think that's the only way you can go about it, is to manually change it in discussion and have some proof behind it. And maybe there's a diary entry, you just haven't made that up. You've got some proof that you had a meeting, and it could be verified by the supply chain if necessary. So, but there are better ways. I would contend there are better ways, and the one better way is to have something, use the feature that we've got called task work. So here are all the tasks that we've later on that we're going to have, and to each one I can just assign a quantity. So it's just a number, and every activity, and this has been in Powerproject for quite a long time. So if we look at the effort and modeling behind each task, this section has always been here for, I don't know, it's got to be 10 years or so. And so that just allows us to say, well, this activity's got 400 something, and this allows us to give it a unit. So, in this case, it's 400 square meters, but in other cases, there is a number of checks, and you can add to this list, and it's a unit, and there's a time unit as well. So I can say, well, I can do so many an hour, a day, or whatever it is. So, so in this particular case, because we've got 400 to do in 4 weeks, so that's 20 a day. So that gives us no change to the activity. So it's just merely there as a measure. But if I change the activity, either the duration, say, well, it's going to take 5 weeks, it's going to work out what the work rate is. So if I just undo that, so if we think, well, okay, we're going to halve that because it's in a sort of social distancing impact zone, it's going to take twice as long. So it has a very similar impact to the resource productivity change that I was talking about, but in this case it won't actually have any impact on any resources assigned to that task. They'd still be there, depending on their modeling, they'd still be there as 2 a day, but and also if I change that to something like 15, then it's not going to show 15. It's going to get rounded up or down so that you end up with a whole number of days in the durations, because people get a little bit perturbed by seeing different sort of hours and minutes. But you can control that. That's a fairly new slight option in tools options, that you can round the work rate down to retain a whole number of time units, that time unit being on the screen which one you've chosen in this drop down. So so what I want to do is go back to what we had before, and I want to do that in a fast way. So I'm going to copy that to the clipboard. I'm going to use Excel as a sort of rapid calculator, that's what it's damn good at. So if I then paste into there and say, well, okay, we're after June, so we're looking at July onwards. So our factor is going to be 75. I've got a little equation here, and so we're just going to select that area. Now it's done a quick calculation. Go back to Powerproject, right mouse click on one cell and paste from this point down, and so we can see the impact across all of the activities. All I've got to do is reschedule and see what the impact is. So I would say, and I might want to still leave notes, which we could do. That's not a mutually exclusive technique, but that just is a good way of backing up with a bit of science the fact that it's going to take a certain number of days, because you can quantify the amount of work and the work rate. So it's more easily supported, I would contend. So I'm going to undo that. So, because the other technique I want to talk about that has fascinated a number of people, and they've asked me to expand on that, is to talk about achieving the same end with calendaring. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly look at calendars and just explain how we got to this point. So I've made a calendar that's called a 5-day week, 50% reduction and 25% reduction, and shaded. So I'm highlighting areas that I'm reducing productivity. So if I look at the Library Explorer and we look at calendars and that particular calendar, then on screen you can see that there are different. So it's the working days are dark red up till the 23rd of March, and then there are sort of slightly less dense red, and then a more dense but not terribly dense red after that, and then they go red again. That's a reflection of how many hours in the working day there are, and that is determined in Powerproject through the use of work patterns. And so you've probably seen this area, but you've never appreciated that. Most people have not appreciated that you can have multiple entries here. So I'm saying we're doing our standard 5-day week from the start of time, whenever that was, to the start of the event. So to the 22nd of March, everything's normal, and then we're going to a different work pattern from the next day to the end of May, and then another work pattern from the beginning of June to the end of July, and back to normal. And those work patterns, I've got a 4-hour day. So in the library, there are also work patterns. I've got a 4-hour day. If I look at Monday, for example, then the only working time I've got is between 11 and 3. So I've only actually got 4 hours. That's a 50% reduction in productivity. And I've got 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. And I've given it this heading, and that heading is coming from something called exceptions. And one of Powerproject's more subtle and cooler features is you can give non-working periods and working periods a different appearance and just identify them as being different. So my 50% effect is a sort of goldenrod, and my 75% is a sort of light purple. So I can set that up really quite quickly, and then I can use it. So if I just drag and drop that onto, so if I take that calendar and drag it onto an activity and let go, I get this dialog, which normally, as I know what I'm doing, I would have this ticked, but I can retain the existing duration and change the dates if necessary, which is what I want to do. Or I could keep the start and end dates and change the duration if necessary, which I don't want to do. And the other one is pretty similar to the top one. And I would always generally say, don't do this and not show again, but I want you to see that. And so then it applies that calendar to this task. And if we compare that to the baseline, we can see the difference that it has made. So it's dramatically different. It's got a different appearance. It's got like a comb effect, because those the sort of higher peaks are the actual 4 hours a day that we're working, and the lower bits are the bits we're not working, which coincide with the stripes, which are the 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. So we've applied a 50% reduction in productivity to that single task, and you can see that ends on the 1st of June, and then it goes to sort of purple, which ends on the 1st of September and goes back to normal. So the massive benefit of this system is it automatically copes with a task that spans those two bridges. So and then we want to apply it to everything. So if I do select all, it would also select the completed bits, which I don't want to affect. I could click on this tool, which is called Area Select, and just draw a rectangle and go to the bottom of the screen, and it would select all the bits that I want. Or I'm going to, the second method I could use is to use select by filter. So I could say, well, I've already got a filter called not started tasks. So rather than that, all this will do is just highlight and select all the ones that I want, and that is a pretty good. I use that quite a lot. I thought I'd show that in case people don't realize it. Perhaps more obvious is to run that filter on the live view. So that's all we've got left in the view. And then I can do select all, because that is all that I'm seeing. So, or I could select a task and do Control A. So there's lots of different ways of doing it, but with them all selected, I can do what I did before. I can drag and drop a calendar, and it's now on everything, not just one thing. So we can very, very effectively, and you see that effect I'm talking about where it spans, and a single activity spans 2 areas. It's going to perfectly sort out that problem. If I relax the filter and we reschedule that, then we're going to see the impact. And normally I would just press F9 and I wouldn't have a warning, but I just want you to see every time that I do that, so we can see the impact that's had. And we can go to the end of our schedule, and now we're predicting that we're going to end on the 1st of December. So I want to highlight the section here in the way that I've previously done on the resource solution. So I go to the grids dialog. It's actually a shading tab. I add a new one. So we're starting at the end of the last period, which is October, and we're going to the 1st of December 20. Of course, I could choose from a date picker. I'm going to choose an appropriate color for highlighting purposes. So then you've got that situation. There's our green note. I'm going to copy that note by Control Drag. So that's just a way of very quickly duplicating. I'm going to select all the text in there, and I'm going to paste because it's I've already copied something to the clipboard. I'm going to right mouse click properties to change the background appearance so it just marries up with that sort of color coding. And I think you've got a very effective way of communicating that to whoever you did, and it's very fast, and I can very easily adjust the date ranges when these productivity impacts are happening. So if lockdown ends earlier than the end of August, then we can change it, reschedule, and we'll show the impact straight away. So I think it's a very powerful measure. And the other thing that took me by surprise really was I spent a lot of effort, maybe, I don't know, half an hour or so, doing the resource one, which of course has still got the massive advantage of it shows you flattening the resource curve. But if we look at the end date, it's the 2nd of December. So I arrived at the 2nd of December by individually changing every individual activity with a different production rate. Whereas if I just took that sort of broad brush approach with calendars, I ended up at the 1st of December. So I'm only a day out. I'm not saying this is going to work in all circumstances, but I did surprise myself by the ability to get to the end result when I didn't have resources assigned. And I think even though this leads to partial day durations inevitably, it's still a very powerful technique. So I wanted to highlight that, but I also want to turn to some external impacts. So we've had to use part of our because we've got to increase social distancing, the impact on our welfare facilities is fairly substantial. We've coped with a social distance queuing and phasing different people, staggering the start and end of the days, so we can get people on site. But we've had to increase our canteen facilities, and we can do that fairly well outside the building. But when we get to the internal finishes, we've got to use part of the ground floor of the building. So for 30 days, so for 30 days, we're gonna take we're going to take an activity, and I'm going to highlight it as being a extra event, a COVID related event, a welfare facility. So we need to have this going for 30 days, and we can put it in place when the first fixing in that area has been done, and that means that we're going to have to delay other things in that area, such as the carpenter first fix, until that's true. And then past that time will be past the peak of resources, and we can go back to an external smaller canteen. So if I reschedule that to see the impact of it, then it does have an impact on things, but it doesn't impact the end date, because these activities ended up still having float. So we've got some costs associated with that, of course, because we've had to provide materials and effort to produce it and take it away. And I can't cover different forms of contract. Depending on your arrangement, you may or may not recover some or all of those costs, but that is one impact. Okay, so so the other impact I wanted to talk about is really on procurement. So so in my work breakdown structure, I've really got three main levels: procurement, construction, and prelims. And we'll talk about prelims in a moment briefly, but I tend to have a separate view for my procurement, just mainly because I've got a substantially different table highlighting dates of many things. But for those people who are not familiar with this fairly standard technique, I would say, is that this is composed of multiple activities in one line, different colored activities for different stages of a procurement process. So this is about letting work packages where we're trying to really end up at what's a sensible date to get the design information complete, so we can let that package. So we need to have that design information at a certain stage, depending on the work package and the amount of design in that work package. Then we need to allow them, we need to send it out to the people who are going to bid and tender on that. So they need a couple of weeks to do that. Then we need some time to assess, select, and award a contract. They need to place an order. They need to have a period of time to do working drawings for detailed design, and then that needs a certain period to be checked, commented on, whatever description that has with the design team, and then they need to go and buy it, make it, mobilize, deliver to site. And so we can then have a link going from the end of this to the start of the first activity or series of activities that applies to. So and I would also say I progressed this. So this also needs progressing, and it can be a difficult thing to get a handle on, because it's often the surveying team who are doing this, and they're perhaps not as responsive as they could be in some organizations to feedback where things are, because sometimes it's difficult to know how much of the working drawings have been done in this particular trade contractor this month, what remains to be done, all that sort of thing. And but it needs to be monitored, because you need to know about that impact, because I think these impacts are probably going to be the greatest on the plan. So anyway, I'm going to pick up my tab and I'm going to split the screen, mainly so that you can understand what I'm doing perhaps better than I would normally. So I'm focusing here on the mechanical package. So we're in process with this. We talked to them, they're socially distancing, working remotely, they can do the working drawings, they can be assessed. It's when we get to the productivity aspect that we're going to be in trouble, and the impact that has on our plan is onto the mechanical first fix activity. So having discussed with them, they're telling us for procurement, it's going to take them, and this is perhaps a good illustration of how useful the object edit toolbar is at the bottom of the screen. So this is going to take 8 weeks instead of 4 weeks to do the procurement. So I can change its impact, and I can also tag it as that we have discussed it with them, and that it's had an impact on the duration, so I can find it later. But also then it means that I can reschedule that so we can see the impact everywhere. And it only had a very small impact on the screen, and I'll try and highlight that just so this activity, if I just remove the drawing and go back to normal. So if I just undo that whole calculation, you see it move slightly, redo the whole calculation, and so it has a minimal impact, so we're cool with that. But then of course there's also a bit of a problem with manufacturing. Have taken much longer. There's a queue, they've been closed, they've got to reschedule that, they've got a lower workforce, da-di-da-di-da. And so rather than just changing the duration, which some people don't mind, some people want to see a single activity highlighted to show you some difference. So the best technique for that is to split this activity into more than one piece, and I'm going to split it after 4 weeks. So I've got a 4-week bit and another bit, and these are now different activities. They've got different ID numbers, they can have different cost, resources, etc. And the only disadvantage with this is only the first one is the thing still tied to the baseline. This now is not in the baseline. So the end variance would be from here, not from here, which you could you could add that to the baseline after you've split it before you change the durations. I'm then going to create a new activity here, which I'm going to code and tag with a code so I can find it differently. I'm going to double click on that and change its details so that is about my COVID impact. At least I was trying to must not picked up my copy and paste ability. There we go. So that's just to give it a name. And then I'm saying, well, we've got to sandwich that between these two bits of work. So I want that to have an effect everywhere, because it's this one that's linked to the activity itself. But actually, I want these links to be identified differently, and I want them to, so I can change their appearance, but also I can do something in the reschedule. So I'm changing their link category. So in the Library Explorer, you can create different link categories, you can give them different appearances, and as you'll see in a minute, we can affect the reschedule differently. So now if I say, well, actually, there's going to be a 6 weeks delay to the manufacturing process, and then we can see what impact that has on the overall result when that is taken into account. So so when I reschedule now, it's had a dramatic effect on the timing down here of the mechanical first fix, but it hasn't impacted the end date. And by having those logic links in that different way, it does mean that I then have an ability to reschedule without those links having an effect. So I don't have to delete them. It's not like having a milestone, or you change its duration. We've just got to change a setting, and then it's as though that delay impact didn't happen, and it's no longer sandwiched between these two. It's just another activity that's unlinked, and it's back at the start of the project. So the those abilities are rather good and appropriate in this sort of circumstance. So so I think we've covered all of the delay aspects, and the only thing that I want to end on in a sort of throwaway note, I suppose, is the impact on finances. So as I indicated a little bit earlier on when we looked at the work breakdown structure, on the left over here, I have a work breakdown structure which includes a prelims section. And so I've got a series of activities, but those activities are hammocks. So there, so if we close up the personnel group and look at, say, scaffolding. So scaffolding is being driven by when the ground floor columns start and when we strike the scaffold at the end. So they're the activities within it that are driving the duration of it, and I've allocated to it a cost center called plant. And the important thing about that is it's not a fixed allocation, it's time based. And so every, in this case, elapsed week, so Christmas counts the same as any other week, it's going to cost us £1,000 a week to hire that scaffold. So so it took this long, and we can see how long that took in duration. So now it's taken us nearly 24 EW elapsed weeks, and if we compare that to our baseline, then our baseline was only 18 weeks. So there was 18 weeks at £1,000 a week. So that's 18, just over slightly, so 8 hours, it's just over 18 grand. And now it's going to cost us 25 grand. So doing nothing other than changing the productivity. There's no more men, there's no more materials. Of course, things might go up in cost, but that's another discussion completely. So the combined impact of that has been that the increase in cost purely from prelims are shown in these two graphs below. So probably this is the most indicative graph. So the blue line is the baseline cost. So that's what that's what the original costs were going to be. So that's just 1,447,000, and the red shaded area is what the costs are from the current actual and forecast, which is pushing 160 at 1,670,000. So there's quite a difference. And the first graph there is the cash flow forecast, essentially, or the forecast payment. So we can project what the original payment schedule was and what it is now. And of course, you can see it's been back-ended. So whether you'll get any sympathy or indeed any financial compensation for that is perhaps another discussion, but it is easy to show that. Now the QSs are going to be doing that in spreadsheets, and they'll be want to do special formula and things, but it is a useful exercise, and it is linked to the schedule. So that's really the end of the techniques that I wanted to share with you, and I hope you found that useful.